So that was a little bit idea about hadith. Now we come to sunnah, because it's important to understand, because sunnah and hadith, sometimes they're used interchangeably, and so people get confused. But sunnah and hadith is two different things. So when you hear the word sunnah, the plural is sunan. Literally, sunnah means a path, a way, a habitual practice that people establish. And sunnah, when we use it, it gets used in three different ways. So when you hear the word sunnah, you really can't quite know what we're talking about unless you understand which one of the contexts it is being used in. Because sunnah gets used as a classification of an action. Sunnah gets used as a source of law. Sunnah gets used as relating to the Prophet. And so it's important to understand that even though you use the word sunnah, there are three different ways in which it is utilized. So the first one is sunnah, which means the classification of action. So you will hear, for example, actions are divided where you have fard or wajib, which is compulsory. Then you have an action which is sunnah. Then you have an action which is mustahab, which means recommended. Then you have an action which is mubah, which means it's okay whether you do it or not. And then you have makruh, which is an action which is disliked. And then you have haram, which is an action which is unlawful. So when we use sunnah in this sense, it's referring to a level of action, a classification of an action, right? Like you make sunnah salah, for example, so it's referring to that it is second highest virtuous action after fard and wajib, which is compulsory. And so something is sunnah. The general ruling for it as an action is that we are encouraged to do the sunnah. If you miss out a sunnah, for example, if you miss out a sunnah salah or a sunnah action or a sunnah by whatever way, you don't get punished for it. But if you reject, so for example, I'm praying my salah and I left out a sunnah prayer, I don't get punished for it. I will be questioned about it on the day of Qiyamah, but I will not get punished. But if you leave out all the sunnah and you don't pray sunnah salah at all, then you will be punished, because that's a rejection of the sunnah. So, but fard is different and so on. So that's one way in which sunnah gets used. All right. The second way is sunnah as a source of law. And here is where sunnah and hadith get sometimes used interchangeably, is in this category, where you say Islam, like I mentioned earlier, right, in the same session, that one of the source of law is hadith, right? The Prophet ﷺ mentioned, I'm leaving two things behind, which is Quran and my sunnah. So it's considered the second main source of Islamic law, and sometimes it gets used interchangeably with the hadith. And of course, the Quran is the first source of Islamic law. And so that's another way in which sunnah gets used. The third way is relating to the Prophet. And that is, sunnah is the saying, the action, the approval, the manners, and the physical characteristic of the Prophet. Now you may notice here a similarity to hadith. And in the slide with the hadith, it says the recording of these things is hadith, but the actual doing of these things is a sunnah. So it's similar to someone who, for example, you're living your life, and then whatever you do, whatever you say, whatever you approve, and all of that is your sunnah. But then someone writes a biography of what you did, say, and do. That biography is similar to, that's the hadith, the recording of whatever you did, whatever you say, whatever you do. So the sunnah is the actual doing, what the Prophet ﷺ actually did, what he said, what the approval, and the hadith is the recording of those things. And so that's an important distinction that we need to understand. So the sunnah is everything the Prophet said, did, proved, manners, description of his character, and all of that stuff. is considered the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so when you hear Sunnah, you cannot draw conclusion unless you find out more. When you say Sunnah, what are you talking about? It has to be, it's going to fall in one of these three different areas. And so this is something that is important to them.